The race is on, and Max Verstappen made it a triple-header hat-trick with victory in the Austrian Grand Prix. As it was a repeat race at the Red Bull Ring, that's perhaps not a surprise, but is this the shape of things to come, or a track that flattered Red Bull in its battle with Mercedes? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer that question and many more are Scott Mitchell and Mark Hughes. Mark, hello, you're enjoying yourself at the Red Bull Ring. A unique occurrence, because we've now had 4 races at the same track within a calendar year. That's never happened before in the history of the World Championship. So do you feel privileged to have witnessed history?
I do a little bit. And also the other bit of history, of course, is that Max Verstappen becomes the first driver in history to win a championship status Grand Prix 3 weekends in a row. So yes, we've seen that too.
Excellent. Always good to break through some barriers. I imagine we'll have quadruple headers coming up soon enough, despite the claims that we'll avoid even triple headers. So we've got a few more triple headers to come as well. And Scott Mitchell, as always, following from your Stockholm mansion.
And anyone who has ever tuned in to the Thursday drivers' press conferences or seen clips on social media will know that is an absolute barefaced lie, Ed.
Has Sebastian Vettel been scrutinising any of your furniture or
he hasn't.
artwork?
Referring to the deer on the wall. It was actually very good eyes from Seb when he spotted that a few weeks ago. It was, in fact, I was so impressed, I didn't feel the need to correct him that he hadn't actually clocked the correct gender of the deer. So it's actually a doe. I
should clarify. It's in fact it's a picture of a deer. I don't want to give the people the impression you've got some kind of trophy hunting room in your mansion that you're broadcasting from.
Well, it is Sweden, so there's every chance. There's also every chance that a live one would just come prancing through.
It's a great shame that those listening can't see you, just for the jeopardy of maybe if some Swedish wildlife walks in. But
no, I don't think it's ever a great shame for anyone that they can't see me.
I'm sure Sebastian Vettel's disappointed. He might be interested to know what books you've got on your shelves or some such. But let's get on with the race. Mark, after the Styrian Grand Prix, I asked you if there was ever any doubts, given how straightforward Max Verstappen's win appeared to be. Given he got a rare Grand Slam, pole fastest lap and all laps led, I see no reason not to simply repeat the exact same question. It was pretty straightforward, wasn't it?
Yeah, his advantage this week was bigger. They've made improvements in the car. The car is faster than it was last week. Mercedes is static, and wacky setup that they tried in the simulator didn't work in real life, and the track temperature was about 20 degrees lower, and the tyre selection was one step softer. The combined effect of all those things was that the Red Bull was increased its advantage over the Mercedes, and in qualifying it even got a McLaren between them.
Yeah, and just so comfortable. Verstappen could make that extra pit stop as well, just to make sure he had the tyres for fastest laps. So this is probably the easiest win of the year for Verstappen. And you have to say, Mark, he is pressing home that advantage, isn't he? Yes, the car was very, very strong, but we've asked the question, can Verstappen do it week in, week out in a championship fight? And that question has been answered resoundingly so far, hasn't it, in the positive?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't think any of us had any doubt, really, that he could do that. I mean, some onlookers may have done, but anyone that's been following his career closely would know that all it would take would be a car of this caliber, and he would be up and away. And of course he is, and he's extracting absolutely everything from it. But I think his perspective has changed to that of somebody with his eye on the world title. You just see it in the little things that he does sometimes, in the way he answers some questions. It's very much someone that has got his eye on a set goal, rather than someone that's just going absolutely flat out because that's the only thing he can do. Because that's the only way to maximise the result when he was in a car that wasn't quite the best. So yeah, he's doing it flawlessly. He's doing it in a way that has again left his teammate sort of a long way behind. Sergio Perez is now starting to move away from his early assertion that all you need to do was just have the car the way Max has it, and we know that works, therefore I'll just drive it like that. He's now realising that actually that's not working for him. And he's starting to veer away and go off on his own setup. And he did get much closer in qualifying than he has done recently. So that's working for him, but it just underlines the job that Verstappen is doing. He's absolutely flawless at the moment.
I think there's something in what Mark said there that sort of speaks volumes about the job that Max is doing this year, which is how he's sort of moved seamlessly into that role of serious championship protagonist. There was a comment from Ross Brawn a few weeks ago where he said he felt well, it might have been much earlier in the season, but he said that he felt Max has sort of changed his approach and is being, I guess, sort of the implication being he's being a bit less gung-ho and playing the long game. I disagreed with that at the time because I actually thought that Max had sort of switched towards that in the last couple of years anyway. You saw it with the way he was able to get absolutely everything out of his machinery pretty much week in, week out. So I don't think that changed, but I think what Mark just pointed out there, this ability to adopt the long game, I think that's what's changed because he hasn't had to do that before. He's been able to go into every weekend knowing that all he needs to do is focus on getting the most out of the Red Bull because he's probably going to be third best behind Hamilton and Bottas, and he might snipe at one of the Mercedes if they have an off day. The key thing that's different for Verstappen this year is that every time he does that, he has that same mindset really into each weekend of wanting to maximise. But every time he does that, it's contributing to a title challenge. So as the season goes on, as each weekend passes, he's moved into the championship lead. He's building that championship lead, and he deeply cares about this end goal. That's now what he's working towards. He hasn't had that in F1 before, and it's just been a seamless transition from the sporadic hunter into the out and out hunted, and he's handled that adjustment probably about as well as we all expected he would when we were discussing last year whether he was capable of putting together a title challenge.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that, you don't doubt it. It's just until you've seen it, you can't be absolutely sure. And he has, just moved straight into it. He's it's almost sort of Prost-like his approach to the championship. Still a long way to go, and inevitably the pressure builds as you get down towards the title denouement. So if it's tight come the end of the year, that'll be another level of intensity again. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to doubt Max Verstappen. It was difficult even before this year, but he's just doing everything absolutely right. But let's have a look, Scott. Mercedes. Valtteri Bottas was second, Lewis Hamilton fourth. We'll get on to the driver in between Lando Norris shortly. Toto Wolff said after the race, and I quote, "It's a good result because if we wouldn't have been stuck behind the McLaren, we would have been racing him. I'm not sure that would have been good enough to win the race, but the race pace was there and would have been good." Are you buying that?
No, not at all. No.
I don't think even Toto's buying that. They might have been the words coming out of his mouth, but I don't think he expected us to believe that.
There must have been a moment as he's saying it where he's just sort of thinking, if any of them think that this is correct, I've lost all respect for them. There was a moment in the race just after Hamilton made his pit stop where he was obviously out, fresher tyres, so he's going faster, and then Max, who must have been 25 laps into his stint at this point, just pumped in a new fastest lap, and then like a lap later pumped in another fastest lap, and it reminded me of I think we might say this a few times with what Max has done when the car's been absolutely on it, but it just reminded me a little bit of the Vettel Red Bull years, just like punching in one of those fastest laps just as a middle finger to everybody else, just to say, yep, I can do this. I think he won by such a huge margin, and it's the same as last week. And he had performance in hand. Was he ever at any point during this race stressed? The run up to turn 3, maybe, and at the safety car restart. Apart from that, he was untouchable. And both of those Mercedes could have had the freest of free runs at him for the entire Grand Prix, and I don't think they'd have come close.
I do think that what Toto said was maybe he was overcompensating for last week. It was all a bit doom and gloom after last week, wasn't it? Oh, we got no development. Lewis said it. Toto Wolff said it, talking about the focus on next year. And I wonder if that was a slightly rare misstep from Toto Wolff, actually, because he's done this glass half empty, as he's put it, view in the past when they've been doing well and keeping people on their toes with, well, let's not get carried away, etc. there's reason to be concerned. It's great when you're out in the lead, but when you're struggling and you've just been pummeled 2 weeks in a row, which is what's been the case at the Red Bull Ring, though we should say it, Paul Ricard could easily have been a Lewis Hamilton win. I think that's perhaps not the tone to take, so they've tried to uplift it, maybe slightly overcompensated, but I do think that they can expect things to be a little bit better later in the season at other tracks, but at the same time, if you had a choice of which car to be driving, it would be the Red Bull, because it is all round the better package. We can bring in the first of the Race Members Club questions now. Of course, those who have joined our Members Club, which you can find out all about by heading to therace.com and not forgetting the hyphen. You have the chance to send your questions in for our race review podcast. This one's from Simon T, which I'll fling at you, Scott. Do you have any indication of the damage picked up on Hamilton's car and what caused it?
Well, it was being estimated immediately after the race that it was a significant amount of damage. I think, wasn't it? Toto Wolff said it was 30 points of downforce or something like that, and it seemed to be damage that had been picked up from, I think, just sort of fatigued parts, then just falling foul of how aggressive the curbs are. So it was basically just sort of deterioration of some of the aero bits rather than like contact or him, catching a particular part of it on the curb. It seems that it was. I think Andrew Shovelin might have specified it was some aero parts on the rear caked in, and it basically just cost them loads of performance. So you remember we heard that there was the radio exchange where obviously Bottas was told that he could race Hamilton, and then it was quite clear that Hamilton wasn't putting up a fight, and it just made no sense. If it could have just heavily compromised their race. So it did seem like the sort of thing that sort of comes out of thin air. Like there's no obvious cause for it, but it's just, even Grand Prix cars, as amazing and crazy and technical as they are still subject to wear and tear. So I think that's what befell Hamilton today.
Yeah, I did have a quick look at the onboards around lap 30 of Hamilton just to see if there was any evidence of a wide moment or anything, and just a quick glance didn't show anything untoward. So it didn't look like he was putting the car in an odd place or anything. Sometimes you can go a little bit further or over a more aggressive bit and cause yourself the problem, but he didn't seem to, at least. We may hear more about the exact cause of that later in the week. But Mark, Scott did mention the little bit of team orders when Hamilton was struggling. Do you think Mercedes handled that quite sensibly and well?
Yeah, at first it was stand by, Valtteri, don't attack yet. Then it was you're free to race. Then it was actually Lewis is going to let you past. And I think under the circumstances, once they'd assessed just how much trouble Lewis was in, that was the fairest way to do it. And then subsequently, I think the idea after that was initially was going to be that they would use Valtteri's DRS to just tow Lewis along and keep him out of reach of Lando. But his tyres were deteriorating so quick with the aero damage that even that wasn't going to be a feasible strategy. So, yeah, it had to be the second pit stop, and he had nowhere near enough pace to recatch Lando after that. So, yeah, fourth place it was.
Yeah, just had to play it sensibly there and limit the damage. We have another question from Simon T. Scott, who asks, do we have any indication of what the Mercedes upgrade that's coming for Silverstone is? Which also connects to a question from Vitor Gregorio, who asks if Mercedes is right to abandon 2021 development to focus on 2022, given it means practically the end of the 2021 championship. Now, we talked a bit about this last week, and there has been a little bit of clarification of exactly what they mean by no more development as well. So what do we know about what's coming and where they're at?
Yeah, I can't tell you what exactly they're going to be upgrading on the car and what's going to be new. We know that basically there is aerodynamic development. It's when that was said last weekend, what was meant is that there's no live development of the 2021 car going on in the wind tunnel, but there were parts that were sort of filtering through the system, shall we say, from previous development work that had been planned for a while, and that they're going to exist on the car from Silverstone onwards. So it was kind of just not entirely clear. It was Toto at the time who'd sort of indicated that there wouldn't be any upgrades. What he meant was that there wouldn't be any development from this point onwards back at the factory. there is going to be an upgrade of sorts for Silverstone. Exactly how much of a difference it's going to make to the competitiveness of the Mercedes is obviously very difficult to tell. Hamilton seemed to indicate after the race today that whatever the upgrade isn't going to be enough. At one point, he said that the Red Bulls are, I think, miles away was the phrasing that he used. So, yeah, they've obviously been doing a lot of work on with what they've got. Mark mentioned earlier that they've been exploring different setup directions as well. But there is going to be a change in specification on the car. They're also still trying to eke a little bit more out on the power unit. You can't make any performance related upgrades during the season, but there is the hope that they'll be able to optimize it better and maybe try and balance the energy management a little bit better, and also just improve the drivability, because I think they're still probably not completely satisfied with what they've got there either.
And as to the question of whether they're right to focus on 2022 with a lot of their research and development, well, they absolutely are, because it's so different next year. And that's not only deciding next year, but it's your 0 point for the new era. So it's essential not to compromise. It would be idiocy to compromise next year for the chance to do a little bit more on what's actually quite a shallow development improvement curve that they've got left on this year's car. They've already said that, James Allison has said that they're not getting the same gains that they generally do with time. So it would be doubly stupid.
Yeah, that's the thing that's made it such an easy decision. They're looking at this year's car and its low reg format with this year's regulations and saying there's hardly any potential left in this car. There's hardly any development potential left in it. There's not a magic half a second to be found if we put a tunnel program on it. Whereas with the high reg, there are still gains to be found under these regs. There's still big gains to be found, and Red Bull's taking advantage of that. So it's the circumstances of each of them have made their decisions very understandable.
Yeah, and interestingly, Christian Horner was asked after the race when they'll stop developing this year's car, and he said, I'll do it all the way to Abu Dhabi, which is obviously just trying to pile on the pressure. But there's always things you can do. Red Bull obviously are very, very good at finding little improvements here and there. But yeah, I don't think we should be too premature in terms of our rush to say that Red Bull's now out of sight. It was just one circuit, the Red Bull Ring. Yes, Red Bull certainly has the advantage, and they're very clearly favourites, but let's see how things go in the next few races. As Christian Horner said, Silverstone is a Mercedes stronghold. But then again, I think we said something like that about Paul Ricard as well. Well, Mark, let's talk McLaren. Lando Norris certainly enjoys the Red Bull Ring. That's his second podium here. He's been in the top 6 in all 5 Grand Prix he's contested at the circuit, qualified second, finished third, split the Mercedes drivers. Where did that performance come from? The
McLaren does fly around this circuit. It is very, very good around this circuit. And a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that it's this circuit has got, I think, the highest proportion of DRS running in qualifying of any circuit on the calendar. So you've got the 3 DRS zones, which comprises over 30% of the lap. So if you've got a car that's configured to have a big DRS stall and a less efficient wing when non-DRS, it's gonna fly in qualifying, because the others have got them balanced in slightly the other direction. So that's one reason. The other reason is that the turns 1 and 3 and 9 just are perfectly configured to suit the way that the McLaren just points at a corner, or at least it does if you drive it the way the Lando does, and it gets the tyres straight up to temperature. And his turn 1 and turn 3 on that qualifying lap, he took chunks out of Verstappen, who didn't have ideal tyre temperature at the start of the lap because of the circumstances of his preparation lap. And he took absolutely loads out of him. Then you could see it. It was visual. Verstappen gained most of that back through the very fast 6-7 sweeps. And then Lando was marginally ahead through 9, where he was absolutely acrobatic all weekend. Fantastic commitment through there. And it was only as the front tyres had sort of given up by the last corner, and he understeered out a bit wide, and that's where Lando got that's where Max took the pole. But it was nip and tuck right until the last corner. So yeah, it wasn't a perfect lap for Max, and it was pretty much all and more of the McLaren's potential that Lando squeezed from it. And then in the race, you can transcend the car's level like that in qualifying, but in the race you're back to normality and you're back to normal DRS running, and so it was quick enough to keep its place for a while, but it was never gonna keep the Mercedes behind indefinitely, and Valtteri ended up doing it at the pit stop because Lando had the 5-second penalty, but in the normal running of it, without Hamilton's bodywork damage, he'd already got past on track. So in the normal running of it, Hamilton would have just been a Hamilton second and a Norris third, with Valtteri trying to get past probably, and then it was well clear of their normal rivals on other tracks. So I don't think. It'd be nice to be proved wrong, but I don't think this pertains to the form of the McLaren on the circuits to come. I think this is a very, very special track for the McLaren.
Yeah, I feel like the McLaren just sort of it just had its peak raised, didn't it? Here, it was as Mark was saying, this is very well suited to this circuit. Norris is a driver on absolute fire at the moment, so it's the perfect combination. And I think one of the things that obviously helped was the extent of the Mercedes issues, because there was obviously still the very clear performance gap to Red Bull. It was evident how much faster McLaren was than the immediate rivals. But I think I think as much as it was McLaren obviously being a bit stronger, maybe the softer compound suited them a bit more. Maybe they learned quite nicely from last weekend, but it was obvious that there was the Merc deficit helped them sort of challenge for second best overall behind Red Bull. But you can't fault the job that McLaren and obviously especially Norris's side did in maximising that opportunity. We saw, didn't we, earlier this year in Monaco with Ferrari, and also in Azerbaijan, at least in qualifying and the start, that I guess it's close enough now that the teams behind Red Bull and Mercedes have got close enough that if either of those two teams falter, and or there are circumstances that suit a team like McLaren or Ferrari, then there is the chance to mix it up a little bit. It would have been absolutely incredible if Norris had been able to see that lap out and get pole. Imagine Verstappen trying to. I would imagine he'd have had a slightly better go of it than the Mercs did. But just if it had been Max trying to get back ahead of him after losing because he didn't have track position at the start, that'd have been an amazing thing to watch. I suspect the outcome would have still been the same, but it still would have been fun. It's just great to have a team that's just able to be in the mix, even if this isn't what it's going to be like in the coming races or at many other races for the rest of the season. It was just really, really cool to see, even if it's just for one weekend.
And I have to say, Norris, he's just really impressive the way he's driving. He's delivered a level of consistency that he needed to find, because he's right from the start in Formula One. He's been clearly very good. He's had some great weekends, but there has been kind of this question mark about whether he can do it week in, week out. And now he's not only doing it week in, week out, he's doing it and more. And I have to say, in qualifying, I was following the McLarens on board, so I had Norris's on board for Q3. In that final run, you talked through it, Mark, but just watching him into turn one, when you're watching live on a qualifying lap and you just sort of see how much speed they're carrying and you sort of think, oh, that's a bit... But the car bit, and he just beautifully just controlled it. A little bit of opposite lock, but it wasn't kind of hanging out and losing momentum. It was just so well driven. And that moment in turn 9 as well, where he had to correct, but it wasn't kind of a panicky correct where you're hanging on to it. It's kind of right, correct, not losing the momentum. Absolutely brilliant. Norris really seems to be at the top of his game at the moment. Now, Scott, as the pattern has been this year, while Norris soars, teammate Daniel Ricciardo generally struggles. 0.3 slower than Norris in Q2, and that was a comparison with Ricciardo on softs compared to his teammates' mediums. Got up to 11th on the first lap, 9th on the restart lap, ended up 7th, but was a lap away from 5th place, given he was passed by Sainz, and then fell out of the 10-second Perez penalty window. So what did you make of his weekend?
Well, I don't want to say what we've come to expect from him, but it's probably about as much as Ricciardo could do on this track. I know we had this conversation during, it was either during the race or before the race, I can't remember, Ed, but I didn't expect Ricciardo's weekend to be any better than a week ago, because the way I interpreted what he and McLaren were saying a week ago is that this track, the Red Bull Ring, exacerbates the limitations that Ricciardo has at the moment. And it's clearly a very long process to try and recalibrate himself to learn how to drive the McLaren. The way that car needs to be driven is clearly something that he can't do properly just automatically. And if that process isn't that quick to fix, then I think coming back to the same place where it was an absolute nightmare for him a few days later is just going to yield exactly the same result. Yes, there are going to be specific things he can learn and put immediately into practice and know it's the same circuit, but with the conditions also being different and things like the tyre compounds being softer, I was just honestly expecting this to be a part 2 of what we saw last weekend for Daniel, and that's what it was. He clearly can't get close to Lando on one lap at the moment when he's finding the limitations as severe as he has at the Red Bull Ring. But then what you see in the race is that we know that delta between teammates tends to come down between qualifying and the race because it's not on the limit. I think Ricciardo takes it pretty far down. I don't think he's far off Lando on race pace at all. Maybe a tenth, maybe 2 tenths. And we know he's a great racer. He's got fantastic racecraft. He'll be probably frustrated that he lost out on whether I can't remember if it was his last lap or his penultimate lap. The way that happened would have been very frustrating. But I think he made a small mistake at turn 3. But otherwise, he did what he could. He made progress where he could. He was feisty where he could be, and he was pretty quick when he could be during the race. And so he's managed to come away from here with a decent run of points. Obviously, after the disappointment of last weekend. So I guess it's kind of a silver lining for him. And as he said afterwards, he just really needed a fun race. And I think he did genuinely enjoy that Grand Prix because it's been pretty battering sort of 10 days or so for him. Very confusing, very up and down. So to actually come away from it on a relative high, I think it can't hurt.
Yeah, he needs to be at least salvaging those reasonable race results. Obviously, not at Norris's level. I was slightly more, not necessarily optimistic, but I was hoping to see a little bit more of an improvement because it is a repeat. Yeah, slightly different conditions. I was hoping to see a little bit more progress from Ricciardo just in getting those corner entries right and listening to the onboard camera and the radio during practice and qualifying. It is clear he's doing exactly what you've said. He's just struggling to recalibrate, and he'll get told to take a slightly more progressive entry, and then he'll be told to brake a bit later at turn 1, and he'll kind of adapt in one bit and then start adapting somewhere else, and then he'll have slipped somewhere else because you just feel he's just thinking about it. It's just not remotely natural. So it's going to be a long, hard season for him, but he is a driver of high quality. Now, of course, Norris had a 5-second penalty during the race, and inevitably we've had several the race club members with questions about this and all the penalties, in fact. Josh Smith asks, what rule was Lando deemed to have broken in the incident with Perez? And he also adds that he sees it as a racing incident. And Tamara Salter asks for our opinion of the 3 penalties that were issued. So we'll work our way through them and see if we agree. So, Scott, lap 4 collision between Norris and Perez first. That resulted in Perez dropping from 3rd to 11th after he ploughed through the turn 4 gravel. 5-second penalty for Norris.
So to answer Josh's question, I think the rule that Lando was deemed to have broken is any law of physics, basically. He's guilty of not being able to hold all of the momentum that his car had and stop it from running to the outside. I see that as a racing incident. How many times have we been here on this podcast and said that an attempted overtake around the outside is basically living by the sword, and if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. It's a risky move. If you pull it off, you're a hero. If you don't pull it off, 9 times out of 10, you probably end up running off track. Leclerc even admitted afterwards, because we'll obviously get onto this, that he had to accept that as someone who went around the outside. So, yeah, on this one, I thought it's the sort of thing that I don't think it should be penalised, but I also suspected it would be, because we've seen a few times, even last year, same track, same corner, Albon versus Hamilton, that it does easily get slapped with a 5-second penalty. So I didn't think it was Norris's fault or merited a penalty, but I suspected it would be as soon as it happened.
Do you agree with that, Mark?
Yes, I do. Yeah. He wasn't driving out there. Perez hadn't got the move done. He wasn't alongside. It wasn't like last year with Albon on Hamilton, where Albon's actually got the move done. He's ahead. He just hasn't got the full car clear. Even then, you would argue that was a racing incident, but this was more so. Perez hadn't even, got himself ahead. So, no, for me, that was just, if Perez wanted to hang on around the outside in the hope that Lando would somehow just stand on the brakes or, somehow magically make the car need less track on the exit, well, yeah, fair enough. But shouldn't be surprised if it didn't work and he ends up in the gravel. I don't see that's worthy of anyone getting a penalty.
Yeah, I think there's a point where Perez gets very slightly ahead into the corner, but then a fraction later, Norris, it's very clear that what's going to happen, and Perez should have just realised where that was going because it was always going to go into a gap that's disappeared. So, Mark, next up, Perez versus Leclerc. Turn 4, same corner, roles reversed, Perez on the inside, and he made contact with Leclerc. 5-second penalty for Perez for that one. That
one's more justified. I would call it a racing incident, but I would say that if you're going to be strict on handing out penalties, Perez was a bit ham-fisted in that. He was on the inside, he was considerably slowed. He could considerably compromised his entry and then had to sort of release some steering to actually get himself in the way. So he'd actually had to take some, active part rather than just letting the car go out there and blocking the other guy. He had to actually steer it out there, and that's slightly different. So I would say if there was any of those three incidents worthy of a penalty, it was that one. But even that one, I would have just probably just give it. What do they call it? Telling off in official terms. Reprimand. Yes, I was thinking admonishment, but I knew it wasn't that. Yeah, I think it may be worthy of a reprimand, but nothing more than that.
The last thing we need is them introducing admonishments into the regulations.
What's a distinction? Admonishment and reprimand. How would you? Admonishment was slightly gentler.
3 admonishments would equal a reprimand.
I feel like an admonishment needs to have an ethical aspect.
Might I suggest that wasn't quite right, Checo? Something like that. Would that be an admonishment?
Especially if they phrased it like that. I quite like that idea. So yeah, I basically agree with you on that, Mark. I do think it was the worst of them. I could live with it being a 5-second penalty. I'm quite happy for it not to be. Scott, are you in the same camp?
Yeah, pretty much. It was cat-handed. There was contact, so it was a bit worse than what Norris did to Perez. And yeah, Leclerc basically didn't have a chance to give up the corner, did he? Because he kind of got biffed out of the way a little bit. So yeah, that one didn't offend me as a penalty.
And let's try and get some disagreement on the last one. Scott, Perez versus Leclerc again. Leclerc went round the outside at turn 6, ended up taking to the gravel. 5-second penalty for Perez. Yeah,
another one that was just I don't think that should be a penalty. It's a high speed corner, very difficult to go side by side through there. We did see later on in the race Russell and Alonso go through there side by side, and Russell nearly lost a place because of it. The only reason he didn't is because he then got very brave into the following corner and sent it back down the inside of Alonso. So you could argue that that's the template, and that is exactly what drivers should do. It can be done, and if you're going to almost lose the position, then that's just hard racing. I agree to a point on that, but at the same time, just because you can go through there side by side without contact, or the car on the outside getting pushed wide, doesn't mean that it merits a penalty if the car on the outside does get pushed wide. It's still a racing incident. If it's 55-45 or 60-40, Perez's fault, it still shouldn't be a penalty. Like I said earlier, Leclerc admitted that he'd taken a risk by doing it, and at some point the car on the outside has to accept that it's not going to work. So I'd have preferred to have seen that dealt with as a racing incident, but they set the precedent with the Norris penalty the first time, so it had to be a 5-second penalty.
Yeah, that becomes the difficult thing. There's two things on that. Firstly, Perez did have a little bit of a rear snap that he had to correct that forced him a little bit wider. He was trying to hold it tighter. So if you're asking a driver to hold it tighter, there's always that risk. And secondly, I did say something to nobody in particular while watching that live, which of Leclerc, which I just said, no, where are you going? Because you just, from the moment it started, you're just thinking, this is going to end up with you taking a bite of the gravel. So I didn't really see where it was going. So, Mark, you've got a last chance to disagree on that. Are you going to are you in agreement on that? Or do you think that should have definitely been a penalty?
No, it shouldn't have been a penalty. It was. I think probably some emotion involved in Leclerc making such a ballsy move. It was, he was still angry at the earlier incident probably, and he just launched it with full commitment. Wonderful commitment and very, very brave, but that doesn't, that alone doesn't guarantee that you should be. The other guy should let you through. And Perez is pretty hard, and he's borderline unfair sometimes, but I don't think he was on that occasion. He was just hard.
Yeah, I think it was a slightly belligerent overtaking attempt by Leclerc, one that's got him a little bit of trouble. And there's a couple of broad questions about the penalties. Tamara Salter says it would be a shame if drivers were hesitant about making an overtake for fear of incurring a penalty. And Peter Clements asks, why does F1 keep going in circles when it comes to penalising hard racing incidents? Because no doubt after today there will be calls for more leniency and then gradually we'll revert to silly penalties again. How can we fix this, Mark? Simple question.
I don't like the penalty system. I never have. And I don't think you can encapsulate the infinity of racing situations into words, because there will always be situations which are way more dangerous than have been accounted for in the words, which don't theoretically carry a penalty, and vice versa, that are perfectly innocuous but break some wording of some regulation that's been thought of with something else completely different in mind. So I think my preference would be for a very strong ex-driver referee, and he makes the calls and he uses the black flag when necessary, and that would be it. I really don't. Even if he gets the call wrong, just like a football referee, it's his call. And then that, if you can combine that with some way of having track limits whereby they're not pended on, and we had a very positive response to the gravel traps introduced here at 6 and 7 rather than the really, really punishing curbs. I think some combination of that would be way better than some convoluted and ever more complex system that just doesn't. It's never going to work. It's never going to be consistent, because every situation is different and every person judging it is different. So you can't be surprised that it's the rulings are inconsistent. The system makes the inconsistency. It's the wrong system.
The inconsistency is the biggest issue for me, and what Mark was describing there about having a strong figure that's able to lay down an emphatic ruling is the key for me, because we don't have that at the moment. I'll sort of be writing something to this effect in a little bit more detail, but my big thing at the moment is, right now, how can a driver tell what the stewards consider to be a fair move? Because when Verstappen forced Leclerc wide 2 years ago, that was just hard racing. He won the race because of it, and we all loved it. But then, and the same a few races later, do you remember when Leclerc bumped Hamilton wide into the second chicane at Monza? But then last year, Hamilton got that penalty for pushing Albon off at turn 4. And the following week, Stroll absolutely dive-bombed Ricciardo at turn 3. And it was only Ricciardo taking evasive action that avoided the shunt. And Stroll didn't get anything for it. And then we get to this year, 2 weeks ago, Gasly forces Norris wide at Paul Ricard. They both go off track as a result. Gasly's come from behind to launch that move, and that's fine. So Norris, for example, was literally given a precedent 2 weeks ago that you can force another driver off the track if you have to, and it's okay. And this weekend he's been penalised for it. So with that level of inconsistency, I don't know how, as a driver, how you are meant to know where the limit is. because it seems to me that every few weeks that limit can be changed. And I think that is a terrible way to manage racing when, as Mark put it so eloquently, you can't confine the infinity of racing within a few rules. So they're trying to make something black and white, and then they also then don't even apply that consistently. So that's maddening to me.
Yeah, it's a stupid situation to have got into. They are dynamic situations that require a certain subtleness of interpretation, shall we say. And while you can't let people get away with outright cheating or ludicrous moves, you have got to just police it more sensibly, and just having too many precise rules actually doesn't work because it doesn't cover all those situations. Shall we move on to Ferrari, Scott? Difficult time in qualifying again, partly thanks to the refusal to run softs in Q2. Sainz and Leclerc started 10th and 12th. Quick in the race, though, another well-executed Sainz race to 5th after starting on the hards. Ferrari seem to have got on top of those tyre troubles they had in Ricciardo and got the balance about right here, haven't they?
Yeah, there was something Mark was explaining earlier about the impact of the DRS zones on the McLaren's competitiveness, and Ferrari seemed to be hypothesising even last week that was where their downturn in qualifying form had come. There was initially a suggestion that maybe they'd overcorrected after their monstrous tyre struggles at Paul Ricard, and basically made the car, done so much to protect the car and the tyres for the race that they'd taken away some quality performance. But the team doesn't think that's the case at all. They think it's just circuit specific. They lacked that pace over one lap. I think the DRS theory makes perfect sense if that's something that the Ferrari is fundamentally weaker on with the DRS effect. Then the phenomenon that Mark was explaining earlier that applies so positively to McLaren is going to apply negatively to Ferrari. But then in the race, they have the usual level of competitiveness. Obviously, when you're in a DRS train, it's unfortunate, but you're at least in the tow of the car in front as well, so that'll be helping. So I think this was just obviously the absolute peaks of Monaco and Baku qualifying wise seem a long way ago. But the car is clearly very good in race trim. And I think what these two races have shown more than anything is that while France underlined, maybe even exposed the extent of the front tyre degradation weakness, I don't think that car has a fundamental tyre management weakness, especially when it comes to the rears. It doesn't feel like something that is inherently sensitive. I remember when in Barcelona they had a really good run there. Didn't have any tyre issues at all relative to their opposition. This feels a bit more like that. So I wonder if it's sort of showing that that France was sort of the sort of exaggerated exception, and as long as it's not front limited, they're going to be okay. But I think when we go back to Silverstone, it could go closer to what we saw in France, where they're weaker in race trim. But here they had decent race pace. It's just obviously they were starting from an uncharacteristically lower place in the queue, just because it just didn't go their way in qualifying.
Also in qualifying, they very deliberately said we don't want to get through to Q3 if it's at the expense of using the soft. So we're just point blank refusing to use the soft, and if that means we don't get to Q3, fair enough. And AlphaTauri and Aston Martin prioritized Q3 and put the softs on and had pretty mediocre races as a result, because the soft this weekend was just not a decent race tyre, and that was known going in. So I think Ferrari took the right call there. They were actually racing AlphaTauri and Aston Martin this weekend and comfortably beat them.
Ferrari were slightly surprised that strategy still they still got done by Williams and George Russell in qualifying. I think the rest of the strategy doing that worked perfectly. They just didn't expect to be jumped by George.
Exactly, yeah. That was a standout performance from George.
Yeah, you can't account for George Russell in qualifying. It's just a complete wild card that's not to be trusted, except for the fact he's going to be very quick. And quickly, Mark, Leclerc was 8th. Connected to that, we have a question from Niels Join, who I've probably mispronounced, in which case apologies, who says, it looks like Leclerc will have his hands full keeping his teammate behind him in the championship. How do you guys think this battle will unfold over the course of the season? Sainz did have the stronger weekend.
Yeah, he did. When the car's not quite there, quite often you see Leclerc sort of really trying to monster it around and trying to, wring the car's neck, and Sainz will be more precise with his inputs, and quite often that gives a better outcome. Leclerc's inherently slightly faster. Sainz has got probably a more scientific grasp of the dynamics and can explain them better. Today's result was really just Sainz making a better call on which tyre to use first, so that because the medium was the better tyre, so he was on the medium in the latter part of the race and was therefore much quicker in the second half of the race when he's on the mediums and Leclerc was on the hards. So they had to make the switch. That was really all that defined them today. It was a better call, and I don't know if that was just a toss of the coin, which one of you is going to do it, or whether that was a considered science decision that a shrewd call that he made. I don't know, but they're very evenly matched, and they're very well matched. They give the team a good bandwidth, and I don't think it's a case of one driver's career will be destroyed by beaten by the other. They're two very high level drivers, and I think arguably it's the best lineup on the grid.
And I think you can actually argue that it's gone pretty much as expected, that comparison between the two. Everything you've run through there, Mark, was pretty much what we were kind of expecting from what we knew about Sainz and Leclerc. Great driver lineup, 2 points separating them, but of course Leclerc didn't get to start at Monaco, so we'll see where things are at the end of the season. Scott, talking AlphaTauri, Pierre Gasly, as we come to expect, had a decent race to 9th place, as Mark mentioned earlier, compromised by having to two-stop after starting on softs. Yuki Tsunoda, he was 12th. He lined up on the grid behind Gasly. Good qualifying performance. There was a lot positive from him, but he not once but twice got penalised 5 seconds for crossing the pit entry line.
Yeah. So weird. Just really weird that it happened. They were here last week and it didn't happen there. So I can't imagine he's really doing anything different inside the car, and yet twice it manifested itself in a rule-breaking pit entry. So that was weird. And it was also weird that AlphaTauri didn't seem to communicate to him that he'd got the time penalty for the first one. Probably because knowing Yuki is not the most in control person emotionally behind the wheel, probably didn't want to, irritate him. I was going to say something else, but I thought I'd keep it polite. And I suspect that's why they didn't tell him until he was coming back into the pits again. But I think they might have told him too late, and because he got told he had a penalty as he was coming into the pits. But it wasn't until he was actually coming into the pit lane itself that he was told it was for crossing the white line at entry, by which time he's already done it again for a second time. So, as weird as it is, surely you tell the driver so they've got every chance of not making that stupid mistake for a second time. Because this is the thing, when it comes to tiny margins of positioning the cars, I'm actually surprised stuff like this doesn't happen more often. Crossing, touching the white line on pit exit, being slightly out of position at the grid at the start with the grid slot, like Gasly had a few races ago. But for this to have happened twice in the same race to the same driver is just a bit weird. And I don't want to make an unfair sort of connection where there isn't one, but I'm not totally surprised that it's happened to Tsunoda, because, like I said before, with the emotional stuff over the radio, sometimes it's like if there's one thing he does lack as a driver, it is a bit of composure. So I just wonder if there's just a little bit of lapse of concentration or lacking focus. But whatever it was regrettable in the extreme.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And ultimately, if they didn't tell him, and I haven't been through all of his onboards to be sure of that, then kind of it goes on the pit wall that the second one happened because he didn't know it was a mistake. So anyway, interesting, because that could have been a really nice weekend for Tsunoda, and that slightly marred it. Now, Mark, George Russell, we've already mentioned him. he had that miracle qualifying, got through to Q3 and did it on the mediums in Q2, which he had no business doing really. He lost 10th place in that long-awaited first points finish for Williams to Fernando Alonso with 3.5 laps to go. He did slip back to 12th on the first lap from 8th on the grid, so was he unfortunate to miss out at the death, or did he only have himself to blame?
No, I think it's just one of those things that he had to take avoidance on the first lap of Tsunoda. Tsunoda locked up and veered in front of him, which forced him into a emergency brake, which allowed about 3 cars to go around his outside. I think that was probably the beginning of where his race began to go wrong. But yeah, I think 10th is about, as much as he could reasonably have expected, and he was unfortunate to encounter an on-form Fernando Alonso coming at him. And if Fernando was even saying, I was really, really sorry that it was George that I was catching, because he's a very big fan of George, and he knew he was depriving of taking that point for Williams if he succeeded. But yeah, it was a crack and scrap between them, I thought, and two really hard races, a generation apart, but very similar behind the wheel. And I thought, it was a great little scrap, and yeah, George lost out. So that's just how it goes. But the Alpine is probably a faster car than the Williams, so probably not that. He couldn't really fault him. Really, he put up a fight, and ultimately he succumbed.
And all the cars that ended up finishing ahead of him that had started behind him are all faster cars, so not much you can do about that necessarily. Scott, we've mentioned Alonso's recovery to 10th. That was more than he anticipated. Now, he did get held up by Sebastian Vettel in qualifying in Q2. Vettel did impede him, yes, cost him a top 10 place in a Q3 slot, but you weren't impressed with that penalty, were you? Can you just explain why?
Yeah, just because I don't like that impeding seems to be zero tolerance. I understand it in principle. I know that it is very unfortunate, and they should definitely be doing strict and harsh things to try and stamp it out. But a little bit like how we were describing racing earlier, I think the nature of qualifying circumstances and the cues that we see, it's a multi-dimensional thing. It's not these things don't happen in a bubble. Vettel didn't block Alonso at the final corner purely through choice and spite. So I just wish they factored that in more. Michael Massey said that the stewards did factor that in and sort of hinted that Vettel might have got an even harsher penalty because of how blatant the block on Alonso was. But I don't really buy that. They let off Sainz and Bottas for breaking a rule that was put in place for this weekend not to create space from the entry of turn 9 to the entry of turn 10. Sainz and Bottas were part of a gaggle of cars doing that, but they were the only two that were investigated for it. And as a direct result of that, Vettel ends up screwed and planted basically at the final corner, and it gets in Alonso's way, having previously been mugged off because he was trying to adhere to that instruction, creating a gap from the run to turn 8 to turn 9. And as he's creating that gap, a bunch of cars come steaming past him and then back him up by breaking the rule and creating a gap at turn 9. So I just thought it was such an unnecessary punishment. And I could just about accept it from the point of view of, okay, you are trying to implement zero tolerance on impeding, so that's fine. Okay, I'll stomach that. But to then let Sainz and Bottas off for breaking that new turn 9, turn 10 rule on the grounds of other cars were involved and it was a complicated situation, and not be able to give Vettel the same leeway, to me, it summed up the whole mess around the stewarding, where they have black and white stuff for certain things, and then they just seem to be able to create different tolerances for others.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Having watched all the onboards, I don't really see what else Vettel could have done there. Alonso did come through to get that point. Esteban Ocon was nowhere again this weekend out in Q1. He made some sort of vague comments about being suspicious about his car, wanting some parts change, although he wasn't specific. So I imagine we'll come back to Ocon in a later podcast. But also, in the last lap of the race, there was that bizarre collision between Kimi Raikkonen and Sebastian Vettel while they were battling just behind Russell. Raikkonen got a 20-second penalty for that, which relegated him from 16th to, 16th, as he limped home behind Stroll, Giovinazzi and Latifi. Colin Gallagher from our members club asked, who do you think was at fault for that? Scott, who are you blaming?
Raikkonen. I just don't think he was concentrating. I think he might have been a bit distracted by Russell ahead, and there might have been an element of Vettel coming over a little bit, but Raikkonen had plenty of room, and it was just a needless bit of contact.
Yeah, 100% Kimi.
There's not enough arguments going on there. But yeah, unfortunately, I agree. It's one of those strange ones. You should have kind of seen it coming, really, if nothing else, because you don't want to have those collisions. But anyway, we did have a question from Colin Gallagher from our members club, who asked for our thoughts on Kimi's strategy. Should he have stayed out longer on the hards like Sainz did? Well, as always, I was watching what was going on down the order, and I don't think it would have made any difference. Ultimately, the strategy of starting on hards and running long that Sainz did worked well, partly because the Ferrari is a competitive car in the race. The Alfa is not quite so competitive. And if you looked at it, Raikkonen's pit stop timing was dictated by when that gaggle of cars he needed to come back through, he could rejoin behind them. He had a bit of a tyre offset compared to Alonso, a bit more compared to others, but ultimately he wasn't lapping quickly enough when he was on those hards at the end of the stint to justify staying on them. It would have just been giving himself a bigger offset, but then he'd have had more time to make up because he'd have lost ground to people. So, yeah, I don't think that was a strategy problem. And Mark, to finish off, let's get back to the front of the field, because the big off-track story was Lewis Hamilton signing on for 2 more years with Mercedes. Seems like good news for Mercedes, Hamilton and probably Formula One as a whole, and it means we'll get some more years of him and Max Verstappen doing battle, hopefully. So, makes sense all around, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. I think it would have been really disappointing, especially if Mercedes continues to struggle this year. It would have been really disappointing for Hamilton to bow out, because it would just, make it look like he was giving up, even if he was retiring for entirely different reasons. So at least this, we get to see the reset of the new regulations, and we get to see a continuation of that battle. And it's the battle of the generations is usually all too brief, and I think we're being privileged to see this one play out, and so we've got another couple of years to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's going to be magnificent to watch, and of course, there's always the danger Hamilton could retire during it, but he's showing no signs of wanting to slow down and walk away from Formula One at the moment. Scott, what do we know about the identity of his teammate next year? Is it simply Bottas versus Russell?
Yes.
Would you like to lay out the landscape? Has it been decided? Is it still being chosen? What would you do?
I assume it is still being decided. If I was a gambling man, I have been in the past and come off very badly as a result of it. So maybe don't trust me too much on this. I think I'm leaning towards it being Russell. Actually, I think Hamilton getting it done now. And doing it for 2 years tells me that, first of all, obviously that he's Mercedes doesn't have to plan for his immediate succession, but they're not going to bin off Russell until 2024. If we buy into the argument of Hamilton doesn't want Russell alongside him, then that means no Russell at Mercedes until 2024. Merck aren't going to take that chance. They know how good Russell is, and if they don't put him in the car sooner rather than later, they're going to lose him. And I just think that the timing suggests that, as we've expected and as Mercedes has said all along, Hamilton doesn't have any bearing on the identity of his teammate. So I haven't taken any of this to be an indicator that Hamilton's staying, that means Bottas is going to stay because he loves Bottas. I actually think it's just more likely that it's going to be George. I don't see any real obstacle to it. I think he keeps strengthening his case, making it watertight. I don't know when it will be done, but it wouldn't surprise me if either at the British Grand Prix or during the summer break they announce George instead of Valtteri for next year.
Yeah, I go the same way. Valtteri Bottas is a good teammate for Lewis Hamilton. If Hamilton was 4 years younger, 3 years younger, you might do something different and consider it. But the simple fact is they do have to plan for that future, especially given you never know. He could have a Nico Rosberg moment and at the end of next year say, actually, I am going to retire, because I'm sure there's that mechanism that allows it in the contracts. And Mercedes do have to think towards the future. I think Lewis Hamilton would be quite happy to have Bottas as teammate, but I think anyone who thinks Hamilton's going to fear anyone alongside him, I think doesn't know a great deal about Lewis Hamilton. So I think I'd go down the Russell line. Mark, are you going to dissent this one last chance to create an argument?
Yeah, I'm going to dissent, and I'm going to say, of course, it's Russell. It's not even a decision. It's just, yeah, of course, it's Russell.
What you need to do now, Ed, is when this podcast gets edited, you need to go back into past episodes and find a point where Mark has said the words Nikita Mazepin, and just slot them in there as his 2-word answer to your question of who's going to be Hamilton's teammate next year, and then just let Mark's Twitter notifications go absolutely berserk.
Well, he has driven Mercedes Formula One machinery fairly extensively, so you never know. I was going to say stranger things have happened, but they haven't, have they? So
I don't think they have.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. So that's a good moment for us to finish. So thanks very much, Scott and Mark. For more from them and the rest of the team, head to therace.com, and don't forget the hyphen. There's Mark's in-depth race analysis there to be read, along with my ever-controversial driver ratings. You can disagree with me in the comments. Scott's also going to be taking a look at Lando Norris and super license penalty points. If you enjoy your racing podcasts, which presumably you do if you've got this far, check out our sister titles, Bring Back V10s and the Race IndyCar podcast, among others. And if you enjoy our witterings and feel so inclined, don't hesitate to leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if video's your thing, check out the Race's YouTube channel. After a frenetic triple header, we're going to turn our attention to the calm before the British Grand Prix storm and the first sprint qualifying weekend. The Race F1 podcast will be back soon to take a close look at what to expect from what could be a very different kind of Grand Prix weekend.